Thank you very much, Bobson. Thank you. Your Excellency, the Governor of Kaduna State, Malam Nasir El-Rufai, our host and celebrant, the Honorable Minister of Interior, OGBENI RAUF AREGBESOLA, Chairman, Nigeria Labour Congress, Comrade Aliu Waba, and all of our the co-participants, friends, and colleagues, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. I believe I left out the Honorable Minister of Finance. I'm sorry, Honorable Minister of Finance, Haji Zainab Ahmed, and all of our guests and friends present. I'm pleased to be here for three reasons. The first is that it's an event to celebrate the birthday of my dear brother and friend, co-traveler and co-participant in the journey of developing Africa's largest economy and what he likes to refer to as the greatest hope of the Black race, Nigeria. The second is that this colloquium keeps up an important tradition of our political persuasion, which we refer to loosely as a progressive tendency, by using the opportunity of birthdays and other special anniversaries of our leaders to engage in public conversations on matters of development and matters of public interest. The third is the importance of the subject of the colloquium, which is government and big development, which I believe calls for some interrogation of the role of government in the major aspects of the economy and development. Or the answer for us to the question where we should be between pro-state and pro-market ideologies. And really, you know, although some of these arguments might appear to be dated, it appears that almost always, just in trying to find our place in the spectrum, we have to somewhat redefine our position and find, you know, where we are exactly. The collapse of socialism in the early 90s initially led to some triumphalism on the part of free market ideologues and exponentially advancing the notion that markets were the ultimate tool for the economic success of nations. So structural adjustment, and many of us will remember the structural adjustment programs introduced in many developing countries, and especially in Africa, at the core of which was cutting back on government expenditure, became the cornerstone of what was then described as the Washington Consensus on the desired macroeconomic framework that would create a truly global economy fueled by market forces. But rather than grow the economies of the poor and indebted countries to which the SAPs were applied, poverty grew and development was stultified. And with the spectacular failure of the SAPs, the World Bank, formally abandoned structural adjustment and replaced it with what they described then as the Comprehensive Development Framework. As a matter of fact, on one occasion, the managing director of the IMF at that time, Michael Kamadesos, declared that henceforth the fund would put poverty reduction at the center of its programs. This new paradigm, beg your pardon, involved increased and more effective fiscal expenditures for poverty reduction with better targeting of budgetary resources, especially on social priorities in basic education and health. I've taken us on this short history of the tensions between the dominant political economies, because the choices we in developing countries are called upon to make today require us to make more or less the same judgments, especially the need to prioritize human capital development and poverty reduction. OGBENI RAUF AREGBESOLA, as many of us who are his friends know, is a repentant socialist, or perhaps why is a repentant Marxist. And I want to repeat repentant, not unrepentant. Repentant because in many ways he has repented from some of his very, very strongly held Marxist views. But I think that he stands out. I mean, I think he as an individual stands out as a reason why one should at least have some socialist blood in them, while recognizing the fundamental role of markets and the public sector. Osun State, which OGBENI governed for 8 years, received the lowest, I think the lowest but one or so, in federal allocations, but was for those years the state with the lowest poverty rate. The incidence of poverty for the state of Osun was, I think, 10.9% in 2017, as against 37.5% in 2010. A sharp drop in the incidence of poverty between the period 2010 and 2018. As of early 2020, the incidence of poverty has fallen further to 8.2%. But why would a state with one of the least revenues record the lowest levels of poverty? I think, to a large extent, it is arguable that the social intervention policies which he initiated then and implemented were largely responsible. The state launched several job creation efforts. Osun State Youth Empowerment Program, which hired about 20,000 young people. There was also the school feeding program, the precursor of the National School Feeding Program, which served 155,000 children at inception and almost 250,000 in all of the over 1,300 public elementary schools in the state at the time. 7,000 jobs were directly created, and there were about, I think, almost 3,700 cooks, and most of them, or perhaps all of them, were women. The program led to an increase of 60% in primary school enrollment, and of course, all meals were served, from the home. Because it's a homegrown school feeding program, the farms and other farms and other suppliers of food items, of course, benefited immensely from the supplies that were made to that program. Some of these programs, as I said, were precursors to the investment programs of the Buhari administration. And I want to emphasize this point because social investment programs, obviously are important, especially in a country such as ours, with very, very high levels of poverty. Now, with the levels of poverty that we have, we're told that the average annual income of in Nigeria, I think, is about 137,000 naira or something like that. For the poorest, not the average annual income. So poverty, I think, is seen as those who are earning below that, from that point and below. But 137,000 naira, of course, comes to something like 11,000 perhaps, or 12,000, close to 12,000 per month. So clearly, you cannot have that kind of situation without looking at some kind of intervention. Obviously, there are those who will argue that the best approach to this will be to enable business, and we'll talk about this in a moment, and enable industry in such a way that the growth of business and industry will eventually mop up or create opportunities for jobs and mop up a lot of those who have no opportunities, those who have no jobs, and provide means of income. And of course, by such means, reduce poverty. But I think the basic problem with this trickle-down approach is that it just has not been found to work effectively or quickly enough. And we find that in very many cases, poverty continues to rise. So direct state intervention, government intervention is crucial. And I'll come to the question of financing government intervention in a moment. But as I was saying about the administration of RAUF AREGBESOLA, indeed, it was, as I said, a lot of those programs were precursors to the investment programs of the Buhari administration. In our first budget, we devoted 500 billion to our social development program. 500,000 young graduates were engaged in the Empower program, and 9.5 million children are being fed daily in the school feeding programs just before COVID across 34 states, I believe that has gone, that is probably higher now. The program employs well over 135,000 cooks and over 100,000 smallholder farmers linked to the program, supplying locally sourced ingredients. At some point, this translated to about 594 cattle, 138,000 chickens, 6.8 million eggs, 83 metric tons of fish that are procured, prepared, and distributed every week. Now, of course, the higher outcomes for enrollment of pupils in school, retention and performance of students have been empirically verified, and I won't go into all of that. There was also the Government Enterprises and Promotion Program, the Trader Money, Market Money initiatives, where microcredit was offered to traders, about 2 million traders in all. And of course, there was also the farmer money and several of these microcredit programs. And I think that these programs are important because they, in many ways, were government's efforts at directly creating opportunities. A country such as ours clearly requires a social welfare program. We clearly require a situation where those who cannot work and those who have no work, and of course the vulnerable, are provided with some way of earning something and are provided with opportunities. Of course, the question that always arises is, how will this be funded? How will you provide, how will you, make money available for these purposes? We have, of course, since the inception of this administration, we've done quite a few other direct social investment type things aimed particularly at human capital development. After the National Health Act was passed in 2014, the federal government in 2018 began including the 1% minimum portion of the Consolidated Revenue Fund, amounting to about 55 billion, to fund basic health care. The fund is designed to deliver a guaranteed set of health services to all Nigerians through the network of primary healthcare centers. Since 2015 also, the federal government has disbursed more than 170 billion in matching grants to states and the FCT under the UBE program, the Universal Basic Education Program. 8 billion naira in special funding grants to states and private providers of special education, and 34 billion naira from the Teachers Professional Development Fund to states and the FCT. There's also, of course, as you know, the commitment of the administration to lifting 100 million people out of poverty. Of course, because we recognize the threats posed by social immobility and by the deprivation of a permanent underclass. Now, the point, of course, is that for many of the challenges that face a developing economy, and for many of the challenges that face poorer countries, there is very little immediate term profit for private actors in addressing those challenges. But of course, we know that there are huge long-term social and economic gains to be reaped. In order to fill that gap, government must come in, government must intervene. And, it is this intervention it is intervention, in my view, in the big development issues, the issues of big development. And my view is that these issues are issues of human capital development. How do you educate the largest population, the largest youth population in Africa, and possibly very soon might be one of the 3 largest youth populations in the world? How do you ensure healthcare for that large number of people? And all of the various issues. These, I believe, are the big development issues that confront us, and we must be able to find solutions to them. It was there's this author who wrote about the entrepreneurial state. I cannot remember his name at the moment. And one of the issues that he was talking about is that we must that the entrepreneurial state is not is a state that allows and opens up opportunities for the entrepreneur, but at the same time does not subscribe to the myth that there is some kind of a conflict between between public funding and private sector interventions, and that myth is not, and that myth that we should not give too much premium to that myth. And I agree entirely that there is clearly a place for there's clearly a place for public sector intervention, and in our types of economies, that place is particularly is massive. Now, I just want to talk a bit about financing these types of interventions. Now, if you look at our situation, I think that in many ways, policymakers in our country, and of course in many developing countries, are tied to these whole issues of trying to ensure that we have a balanced budget. We're focused on budget deficits. Everyone is, riled up about debts and all of that. Now, I want to say that, of course, it's important for us to pay attention to the debt burden. It's very crucial that we pay attention to it. But I think more attention should be paid to the question of what we are spending our debt on, and whether, even if in the short term, our debt it creates a burden, whether it yields the types of long-term benefits that will make sense for our economy going into the future. I think that that's a very important consideration. I think that balance is always important. In our case, of course, we have a revenue problem, as they say, probably not directly a debt problem. In other words, we're not generating as much revenue as we should, which speaks to the issues we have with inadequate domestic resource mobilization, and mainly, and of course, creating an environment that would enable business to flourish in such a way that we're able to provide opportunities and, of course, revenues for government as well. So we have those challenges. But one of the things that I would like to say is that we must keep our focus on the people. We must keep our focus on how to ensure that we're able to provide as much opportunities as possible for the people. Now, that's two things. The first is in the direct interventions that we're talking about. And I want to say, and I agree with that, there's also, I'm sure that some of us have come across the book by Stephanie Kelton, where she was talking of the deficit myth, where for an issue of currency such as ourselves, we mustn't always reason as if we're a family or an individual. So the individual, for example, is, of course, anxious to ensure that they spend only what they earn. In the case, of course, of nations, we must go beyond spending what we earn, inevitably, which, of course, is what results in deficits. Of course, we're different from a currency issuer such as the United States of America, which issues dollars. I mean, it's a totally different set of circumstances. But I think that the use of ways and means for providing social welfare, the use of ways and means for providing succor, is something that we ought to do intentionally, but we ought to do with proper modeling. Of course, we should model how will this impact inflation? How would it impact, the other indices of growth and all of that, the other macroeconomic indices rather? How would it impact those things? But I think it's important for us to recognize that we cannot be embarrassed about the use of ways and means, especially for major government social welfare programs. I don't think we should be. I, for example, believe that we should be doing something in the order of about 1 million direct jobs now, and paying for those direct jobs as we paid for the Empower program. We should, and we should make the provisions for doing so, because we have an emergency, and we should be able to make those provisions. But secondly, we must also open up the place for business. At the moment, business is stultified because the environment simply is not optimal for doing business. And I think that we must create that optimal environment. A lot of our agencies, customs, NAFDAC, and a lot of these agencies see their roles as the roles of police, as policemen or women, and also as persons who are charged with revenue generation, as opposed to trade facilitation or business facilitation. And I think it's important for these agencies to get the right orientation, which is part of the work we're doing at the PEBEC with the Presidential Enabling Business Council. I think, I believe that opening up the space for business, further reducing taxes, so that businesses can access, so that businesses, more investments can come in. Fixing our foreign exchange problems. One of the major problems today is really the fact that with the kinds of exchange rate arbitrage that is possible, there's kind of exchange rate differentials. It's difficult for people, for dollars to come into the country. It's difficult, of course, for investments to come into the country. Who would bring in their money at an exchange rate, at an official exchange rate, which is about 60, 70 naira away from what market, or if you like, the parallel market is saying. So we need to fix the exchange rate situation in order to be able to attract investments. And of course, as I said, fixing the business environment itself, because ultimately the drivers of this economy will be the entrepreneurial abilities of the Nigerian people, where we must release that. People want to work, they want to invest, but the environment has to be right for doing so. So I think I'll just end my comments there. I meant to speak for only 10 minutes. I think I've exceeded that by a bit. So I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity to say a few words. And I hope that we'll all have an interesting conversation. I see so many different people who will be, so many different ideas already, but just by looking at the faces of people who are here. So we look forward to the interactions later on. Thank you very much.